so this presentation today is one of a series of social medicine grand rounds, which we have kind of semi-monthly. It's sponsored by the Rangel Center for Social Medicine and the research theme in health equity and transactional social sciences. By now, I think you probably have made contact with either Ethel Roxas and myself. If you would like to come to more of these events, please email us and get on one of our mailing lists. We'd like to see you in the future. Professor Rogers, Naomi Rogers, is our guest today. She got her undergraduate degrees in Melbourne University and her PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. She is professor of the history of medicine and the program in the history of science and medicine at Yale University, and was this past year director of graduate studies. She is the author of 3 books, the most recent of which, Polio Wars, Sister Kenny, and the Golden Age of American Medicine, which came out from Oxford in 2014, received the American Association for the History of Nursing's award, Lavinia L. Dock Award for exemplary historical research. I recommend it to you. And she has published extensively in the medical, public health, and historical literatures. Her research interests include the 20th and 21st century history of medicine, health equities and social justice, gender and health, public health and disease, disability, feminism, alternative medicine, health policy, and health activism. Her current book project under contract with Oxford is Health Radicalism and the Humanization of American Medicine, which examines critics of medical orthodoxy since 1945, including civil rights, consumer, and feminist activists. In 2017, she was honored as the Phelan Garrison Lecturer by the American Association for the History of Medicine and drew on this current research in presenting her lecture, Radical Visions of American Medicine, Politics and Activism in the History of Medicine. And she'll draw on this work again today in her talk here, Health Activism and Social Justice in American Medicine, 1945 to the present. Dr. Rogers.
Thank you, Marsha, for that introduction. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So yes, this is a talk that is based on the book I'm writing on the history of health activism since 1945, which is an enormous topic. So not only am I not able to cover it properly in this talk, I'm not going to be able to cover it properly in the book either, and I'm going to have to make some brutal choices. So today, this is a sort of outline of what I want to talk about. I'm going to begin by talking about Nazi medicine and discrimination in medicine, especially anti-Semitism, move to the atomic age, and talk about physicians' response to that, then talk specifically about questions of race and civil rights in medicine, move to talk briefly about feminists who challenged the medical establishment, and then with a brief discussion about recent medical student activism. So here, just to make myself feel better, I'm listing a number of the possible topics on medical activism, which I cannot possibly talk about all of these, but I'll talk about a tiny bit of some of these. Some of these emerge more importantly at particular moments since 1945, and some of them are much more issues of continuation, as you'll see. So let's begin in the late 1940s and through the 1950s. Really epitomize the way that medical education and the structure of the medical profession is really epitomized by a famous sociological study published in 1961 that looked at a group of medical students at a Kansas medical school through the 1950s. There were a few medical students of color, and there were maybe 2 or 3 women in the classes that they looked at, but they didn't study those. They said that was relevant to what they were looking at. So instead, they looked at these young white men and talked about the way that they were socialized into becoming physicians through a process. And I think in every way, the description, boys in white sort of tell you what you want to know. So medicine was a very high status profession, and it was also known to attract pretty much quiescent guys, people really interested in science, people who really put their head down, people who were hoping that once they graduated and got a job, that they were going to do well, that maybe better than the way their parents had or their grandparents. And of course, it attracted many young men excited about the power of medical science, especially during and after the Second World War. The incredible impact of penicillin, both in the war and then especially after the war. Penicillin became one of the most prescribed drugs for almost everything in the late 40s and early 50s. A widespread expansion of tranquilizers, many other drugs, and of course the exciting control of polio with the 1955 Salk polio vaccine. But now I'm going to spend really the rest of this lecture talking about the unsettling forces that many medical students and physicians had to confront, beginning from 1945 and going forward. So of course, very early on after the war, you start to hear a wider conversation about the fact that in Nazi Germany, there had been Nazi physicians and researchers, so not only physicians, but also researchers, who had experimented on concentration camp prisoners. And beginning in 1946 through 1947, there was a very well publicized trial, the so-called doctor's trial. There were other trials, there were other military trials. But this, and you can see here, two lines of very eminent senior physicians and researchers, scientists from Germany, accused of medical experimentation. Now, it is as a result of this trial that many physicians, including the editor of the AMA, begin to talk about, well, what does this tell us for the ethics of the way doctors should treat one another? And it's as a result of this that one of the major prosecutors, witnesses, Andrew Ivy, comes up with what we now call as the Nuremberg Code. And here I'm just listing some of the major elements of the Nuremberg Code that is accepted in 1948. And everybody says, well, now we have, just in case we didn't realize we needed it, now we have one. But in fact, it was simply a code. There were no enforceable regulations in the US until the 1970s. And I will go further and say that most American physicians felt that this was really a code only for people who were Nazis or maybe possible Nazis with Nazi tendencies, right? And really it had nothing to do with good patriotic Americans. They didn't practice this kind of experimentation, and it really was irrelevant to them. In addition to this, the AMA approved prisoners as appropriate subjects. They had been already subjects, but they argued that even within the Nuremberg Code, that should be seen as ethical research, and actually prison research expands as a result of this. It's only in the 1970s, with the exposure of the Tuskegee syphilis experiments conducted for 40 years by the Public Health Service, the government physicians, that we end up with congressional regulations. So during this period, many veterans, especially Jewish and Black veterans, were horrified to realize that they had fought against fascism and discrimination, but nothing much had changed at home. And so they begin to protest much more actively against medical discrimination. They come together in local and state commissions, committees against discrimination, in which they also point out, for example, that Negro physicians as well as Jewish physicians denied access to medical schools, to hospitals, to a whole range of professional opportunities, irrespective of their qualifications. And there also, you start to see the gathering of statistics about the way that medical schools have quotas. Now, it's pretty easy if you're running a medical school to refuse to accept a person of color. You believe probably that you can tell by their picture, and everyone submitted a little photo, right? But it's much harder to know who's Jewish. So that along the East Coast, and this is just a graph from New York City schools, the easy way to figure out how to get rid of Jews, how not to accept them, was to just have a quota on graduates from City College, which was CUNY, which was a free college that many, many ambitious Jewish kids went to in order to try to hope to go to professional school. So you just restrict City College. Yale did this as well, among others. So I don't really have a slide to say to you, anti-Semitism continued, but I certainly have talked to a number of activists who were Jewish and went to medical school in the 1960s and talked about how their fathers had been refused and how proud their family was that finally a Jewish boy was admitted to medical school. So I feel I can definitely say that the quotas broke down by the 60s, but here's just an example, and this was a topic that was widely discussed from a novel gentleman's agreement, the agreement that you just don't talk about, how you already know who not to accept to your club, to your hotel, and so on, which was made into a movie the same year, in which a journalist, this is totally unbelievable because Gregory Peck never in 1,000 years anyone would think he was Jewish. But anyway, and here he pretends to be Jewish and then is shocked to find the kind of discrimination that he faces. And in one moment, his doctor first is warning him not to go to consult with a doctor with a Jewish name. And then after he learns that he's Jewish, he drops him as a patient. So the other major issue for this era, of course, is whether physicians have special responsibility in the nuclear age. This is a moment by the 1950s. You start to see slowly discussions of the impact of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And you also start to see increasing numbers of atomic tests beginning in the Pacific and then also moving to the mainland in Nevada by the 1950s. So the US took very seriously its role as a researcher for looking at the impact of the bombs in Japan and set up the Special Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission in 1946, in which a whole variety of physicians and researchers, including geneticists like James Neal, among others, went to Japan in order to study radiation victims. And they firstly were just interested in the impact of the bomb, and then gradually also began to realize that to study radiation was also a question of genetics, hereditary, and so on. The Atomic Bomb Commission offered no medical care for the people that they studied. Right? They were research subjects. And here's just an example of specimens from these research studies. At home, there was a wider sense, especially after 1949 with the development of the Soviet bomb, that atomic war might happen. It was just one of those things that might happen. We just had a war, there'd be lots of bombs, right? And these would just be slightly different kinds of bombs. And so you see the sort of domesticating of nuclear war and the kind of fallout that was likely to happen after a nuclear attack. Many of you have seen movies of the duck and cover drills that school-age kids were. You duck and you hope that your desk will protect you, from the initial flash, right? And then also fallout shelters, which were which individuals were encouraged to build in the basements of their houses. Now, physicians had critical roles in this. This was called civil defense, and physicians were in charge of civil defense. They were in charge of civil defense drills, and they gave talks, public health physicians, pediatricians, and so on. How you look after your family in a fallout shelter, how long it would be safe to be in a fallout shelter before you can leave, and so on. Increasingly, the public became aware that fallout from the tests already, right, the ones in Nevada, among others, were starting to enter their daily lives, including the soil and grass that cows ate, among other things. So here, just a famous example of a concerned housewife with a little kid, right, testing, using a Geiger counter, right, to test. Now, where the public gets these fears from is the anti-nuclear movement. And here I'm just listing 3 examples of important groups: a Committee for Sane Nuclear Policy, known as SANE, that had ads like this, is this what's coming to a milk bottle, with a poison sign. Women's Strike for Peace, which was very much a maternalist group that argued that if we care about our families, we had better care about the atomic testing and try to stop it. And Physicians for Social Responsibility, founded in 1961. Anti-nuclear activism, they argued, should be part of a physician's role. And here's an ad from SANE, in which they used eminent physician, popular pediatrician, Dr. Spock, who in his wonderful waistcoat and suit is looking at a little girl worried, right, because what will happen to her future. And Physicians for Social Responsibility also attempted to use their own medical skills. And so a group of young physicians, Bernard Lown, Jack Geiger, among others, did a series of articles based on taking on the implications of civil defense. And they picked Boston. And so they looked at, with the help of nuclear physicists and so on, what would actually happen if a bomb fell on the Boston metropolitan area. And among many other things they found is that thousands of physicians and nurses would die, right? They would be dead, right? So it's no good saying, go to your nearest hospital. Like, who's there? And so that there can be no, they argued, effective medical aid, only prevention. At the same time, you see the emerging public awareness of the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement certainly did not begin in the 1950s, but it gets a new kind of energy, especially from many angry Black veterans who feel that they have fought fascism at home and now are just facing the same old that they left when they joined the army. Even though the army gets desegregated, but the country does not. So here is just some examples of this earlier civil rights movement and the very violent and dismissive response by state troopers, local police, all of them, white, of course. There is a major white resistance to the civil rights movement, which includes violence and murder. 4 little girls are killed in a bombing in Birmingham. 3 volunteers who had come down to Mississippi to work for voter registration are killed in 1964, probably by the Klan. The FBI says, I don't know what happened. There's violent attacks on the march from Selma to Montgomery in 1965. So in response to many of these things, you see a group of physicians who come to call themselves the Medical Committee for Human Rights, founded in 1964. This includes both progressive and liberal activists who believe that physicians and actually nurses also have a responsibility to help the civil rights movement that goes beyond raising money. And so the idea is that They should travel to where these protesters are facing violence and try to give medical aid, because most of the doctors in the South are refusing to treat injured protesters. And also they should provide a medical presence. This means just standing at a jail and watching a jailer dealing with protesters and finding that if you stand there and you're a suit, jailers are much less likely to engage in brutal attacks on. And so it works, if you see what I mean. And these are some of the founders and major leaders of the Medical Committee for Human Rights. But I want to make the point, and here you can see them marching, and then another example of them marching. It's extraordinary in 1964, 1965 to see doctors in suits at a demonstration. Like doctors don't do that. All right, so it has an added sort of shocking look that we need to remember when we look at pictures like this. Just to say a little bit about the practice for Black physicians. Black physicians were forced to practice in segregated communities and in segregated institutions. There was massive federal funding for the building of new hospitals or expansion of hospitals, known as the Hill-Burton Act. But this is the only act that Congress has ever passed that had the phrase separate but equal. I don't mean the policy wasn't there, but this actually had that phrase because there were a number of white Southern senators who were terrified that it would lead to integrated hospitals. So this is why. And here I give you an example of Grady Memorial Hospital, which opened in 1961 with Hill-Burton money, and it has two wings, black and white. They're both air conditioned. In response to trying to attack this, a dental surgeon in Greensboro, North Carolina, backed by a group of Black physicians and with the support of the NAACP, sues the local hospitals that had federal money from the Hill-Burton Act, and they win. And the Circuit Court and the Supreme Court rules that it was unconstitutional to use these federal funds in a discriminatory manner, and that professionals and patients should be granted the privileges and services they seek. And Simpkins, in many ways, becomes the Brown versus Board of Education for hospitals. This is made into part of law in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which has a special section about hospitals and medical care, but in practice, it doesn't always work that way. There were many federal laws during this period. This is expansion of the Great Society, which attempt to get rid of racism and to expand access to health care. The Civil Rights Act, I've already mentioned. The Medicare and Medicaid passed in 1965, which was opposed by the AMA. So it's also very important to remember that as people began to go to medical school, what they saw was not only white supremacists here, right, attacking the Civil Rights Bill, but also the AMA itself arguing that no, this was government, this was socialist medicine, and they lost, and the AMA lost in 1965. Both white and Black physicians protested racism in organized medicine, especially medical training. Edith Irby, later Edith Jones, was admitted to the University of Arkansas in 1948 after an NAACP lawsuit based on the idea that if it was really separate but equal, every state should provide equal training, and you can't just have a little building and say that's a medical school. You have to actually admit them to a medical school. So until Brown, this was a very effective way to try to get a few token people in. But there was increasing attack on the AMA. And again, remember, these are doctors with sandwich boards on them, doctors in suits with sandwich boards. And there was a series of picketing that finally led in 1968 to the AMA agreeing that it would get rid of racial discrimination. No, don't worry, it will be fine. A couple of medical and nursing students went south. Some of them with the Medical Committee for Human Rights, some of them with SNCC, some of them just because they felt that was the place you needed to go to make a difference. And we know a little bit about this with the example of Fitzhugh Mullen, who was a medical student at the University of Chicago, who went to Mississippi in the summer of 1965, set up a community health group, and then returned to Chicago, graduated in '68, became a pediatrician and a civil rights and student activist, and in 1976 wrote an autobiography about his experience as a medical student, as a student in Mississippi. And so we have a slightly better sense than we might have. But for most medical students, their Mississippi experience was the city hospital. Most medical students in 1965 were white, middle-class men and a few women whose experience of medicine was probably their private pediatrician. And it was after they were in medical school, and in their third year, they were sent to the city hospital. They'd never seen a city hospital. They didn't see one on TV either. It was an unbelievable shock for them. And it made them criticize the images of medicine that they'd seen on TV and in the movies. Right? And here's just some examples from TV, where you always have an older, genial white physician helping a young white guy who just wants to do the best he can for his patients and is always able in 50 minutes to do that. Right? It was the experience of the students who went to Alabama and Mississippi in particular, though not only, that led to the founding of a new civil rights youth medical activist group, the Student Health Organizations, SHO, in 1965. And they themselves argued that they had become burdened once they came back to medical school by the recognition of the moral barrenness of the American health establishment, its educational process and systems of delivery. SHO had its first national meeting in 1965, representatives from 25 schools. By 1968, there were 40 states sent representatives to their national group, and there were at least 60 newsletters. I have not read, well, 60 newsletters. Bill Bronson and Michael McCarvey, both medical students from USC, were some of the founders of SHO, and as was Fitzhugh Mullen, and they wrote a treatise as part of a reflection on radicals in the profession. So this was an example of the medical radicals, arguing like modern universities, health schools must be responsive to crises in community health and social justice boiling in every community. So they were very aware of being part of that same youth generation. SHO produced pamphlets. Here a guide from Chicago, arguing, among other things, telling patients, hospital patients, everyone has a right to good health care. I'm not sure that was true then or now, but it was sort of, a goal. And here's just an example of some of their many beautifully named newsletters. But the most powerful impact that SHO had were their summer health projects, funded by the Office of Economic Opportunity. So the federal government, these paid medical, nursing, a few dental and law students to take the whole summer and be part of a community health project. And the idea was to help themselves understand the local problems, to also maybe ideally talk to physicians in the community who had refused to treat poor patients and make them see the error of their ways that didn't work quite so well, to understand the community's needs, and also then to be able to return to the medical school and say, this is what our education needs to be about, right? We come from the ground, we know what's going on. Also, the summer projects explicitly, with federal money, mentored teenagers of color in order to interest them in medical careers. And as one of them, and they all had to publish reports and these beautiful long interesting reports. Students get a first-hand exposure to the health problems of the poor and a glimpse of what the health system looks like from the bottom up. In many ways, I would argue that this was really the emergence of a kind of health new left. And here I just give you some sort of examples, both these young white men looking into the community, sometimes with housing projects behind them, sometimes looking into the community. Interestingly, it's turned upside down. You can make a philosophical argument about that as well. But the idea is this is what students and physicians should be doing. They should be looking into the community. There was a new kind of style for medical students. Che Guevara, everybody had posters on their walls, not just medical students, many student radicals, but medical students loved Che Guevara because he had been a physician and famously put his black bag down and picked up a gun. Now, I'm not saying he did that exactly, but he did move from being a physician to being a revolutionary and then was killed, right? He was a martyr for the revolution. While Howard Levy was a slightly older physician who was drafted, which is what happens after you finish medical school. You can put it off for a certain point, but then you're drafted, and was sent to South Carolina and told, he was a dermatologist, to teach Green Berets dermatological work that they could take to Vietnam, and he refused, said no. And so he was arrested and court-martialed. There was a long trial, which included people like Benjamin Spock coming down to be a witness for him, but he lost that and was sentenced to 3 years of hard labor, and then returned to New York as part of the health radical movement by the early 70s. At home, or in the medical school, what happened? So I think this is particularly interesting. Medical school administrators, including the deans, were really quite supportive. They sponsored the health projects. They encouraged faculty to be mentors. They allowed students to be on faculty committees. They set up conferences on the Negroes in medicine and so on. They introduced affirmative action. And it really doesn't sound like the kind of medical school that I was describing in Boys in White, say. And I think that this was partly a kind of feeling that the world was changing and they had better do something small. But it also was, and here I suggest, it was a hope that maybe you could let in a couple of candidates of color if they all were like Sidney Poitier. Right, so here's Sidney Poitier from Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, where he plays a gorgeous, cultured, young physician and infectious disease specialist who wants to marry a young woman and promise, I mean, it's absolutely clear, he's moving to Geneva. He's going to work to the WHO. They're never living in California, right? They're going to be far away. And of course, there was also a fear that the student movement would come to the medical school. And especially in April 1968, when students took over Columbia University, I've spoken to medical student activists who said, you know, they just looked at the deans when they came to make demands, and they just thought to themselves, Columbia? And they didn't say, what else did you say you wanted? What else was that? So that was also a very helpful moment by the late 1960s. This is part of a story about medicine and the anti-war movement that I don't have time to talk about enough, but it's absolutely clear that medical student activism was part of the anti-war movement. Here you see examples of students or young physicians in white coats at anti-war demonstrations, a widespread recognition of the disabling consequences for veterans who were in the war, some of whom became anti-war activists, not everybody, and also, of course, the actual effect of the war itself. So now I'm going to switch gears and go back to the late 1940s and talk about the boys part of Boys in White. So here's a guide from a high school guide, How to Become a Doctor. And these are the pictures of some of the chapters. applying for admissions, a young man, that's a typewriter, guys, studying what it's like to be in medical school, right? Studying a skull, and success and failure in medical school. Here you see a young married medical student with 2 children, and his wife is hushing her girl so that daddy can study. Right, so there's a role for women, and that's the role. In fact, medical school until the 1970s had a 4 to 6% quota for women applicants. Some accepted almost none, but those who did accepted about 4 to 6%. Deans used to say there was enough to fit around a dissection table. And indeed, women who chose medicine, who wanted to go to medical school, were seen as rejecting social life and family life. And in the high school guide, this is the one picture of a woman physician who clearly, look at her hair, she looks terrible. She looks sad and lonely, right? She's probably like a pathologist, right? And no one's ever going to talk, right? And she's never going to get married. So I can add examples of this, but so, and even then in the early 70s, as somewhat more women were accepted, you still see a fierce suspicion of what it means to have women in a medical program. So here's a woman who was applying to medical school in the early 70s, 9 men sitting around my table, my medical school interview, grilled me the entire time about what form she was married, what form of contraception I was using. Would I promise not to get pregnant while I was in medical school? How could I possibly hope to be both a doctor and a mother? Right, so these were explicit arguments that women applying had to address in front of their interviewers. I also want to say from my experience as a professor of many people who have interviewed at medical school, don't think all those questions have gone away, even though they are now legal. Just saying. Now, women in high school, women in college, were really excited, just like their male friends, about the civil rights and the anti-war movements. And they joined those movements, and they were activists in those movements. But they found that as they joined them, they were often just seen as secretaries, like note takers, coffee makers, and maybe sex partners, right? Those were their roles. And it is really the frustration that comes out of this that leads to the expansion of the feminist movement. So here's a slide that you could say, medical schools saw the light, right? So suddenly by 1970, 71, the numbers of admissions are going up. Look at that. I guess the deans listened, not so much. This is the result of a nationwide lawsuit in 1970 by a group of women lawyers who threatened every single medical school that they were breaching the Civil Rights Act, which also had discrimination against sex as well as race. And suddenly you'd be amazed how many qualified women medical schools found the next year. Just amazing. So this was part of the emergence of the feminist movement. Again, I can't talk about all the various elements of this. They attacked the patriarchal American family. They protested unequal pay and unequal education that many of them had experienced themselves. And they called for a woman's control of her own body, most famously with the founding of the feminist health movement and women's guides like Our Bodies, Ourselves. Feminists were really angry about medical sexism and the sort of culture of medical sexism. And so here's an example. This is an ad in a mainstream medical journal promoting the pill that shows a happy housewife, thinking about how the day goes with the roast on Sunday, and then, then you do the laundry on Monday and whatever. So that this product works the way a woman thinks, by weekdays, not cycle days, right? And they also set up alternative institutions like feminist health clinics, abortion referral groups, and so on. We know a little bit about the kind of experience of this small but growing number of women students in medical school from a survey done by Mary Howell, an MD, PhD, who was the first woman administrator at Harvard Medical School in 1972. She just sent a questionnaire out to women across the country who are in medical school. And here's just some examples of that. A hospital director saying someone looks more like a cleaning woman than a medical student. I wonder whether that's also a racial comment, right? Maybe a woman of color in medical school. A lecturer saying the only significant difference between a woman and a cow is a cow has more spigots. A fellow student attacking women students by saying it's because of you that a man ended up in chiropractic school. This was actually not true. This was an era of incredible expansion of numbers of medical schools. And then to me, the most bizarre, the head of OBGYN saying a woman doesn't belong in the ER except as a nurse. What? But that's the kind of thing that they reported. Feminists demanded access to birth control and to abortion at a time even before Roe v. Wade, and warned about dangerous drugs and devices that many women's physicians just didn't read the research on, or didn't care, or didn't give enough information to their patients. And I'm just listing a couple of examples: the high estrogen pill, the Dalcon Shield, which is an IUD, and DES, a synthetic estrogen used as a morning after pill, which was extraordinarily dangerous and tetragenic. It's as a result of this focus, especially around questions of reproduction, that we see the emergence of reproductive rights. Now, this was a cross-racial movement, and the idea was that white women would come concerned about access to issues like birth control and sterilization, and women of color came warning about the danger of coercion in family planning clinics, sterilization, and so on. And there was this meeting together of these groups of women like this. Most famously in New York, the Campaign for Abortion Rights and Against Sterilization Abuse, in which a hospital administrator in 1975 told them that in most teaching hospitals in New York City, everybody knows that you do elective hysterectomies on poor Black and Puerto Rico women to train the residents. Like, that's just what you do. And was a result of these kinds of comments and also research by this group that led to guidelines both in New York City and later federal guidelines. Now, just to sort of jump ahead briefly here, reproductive rights is no longer the way we think about this issue. It's now known as, and has a different valence, reproductive justice. It was renamed in the 1990s by women of color, very frustrated about what they felt was narrow, white-centered, pro-choice feminism, and instead argued that rather than talking about choice, which was often not even a word that many poor women could use, that you should talk about access, that you should put marginalized women at the center of advocacy. And in 1997, Sister Song, a reproductive collective, pulled together a range of groups of women of color around this notion of reproductive justice. And again, I don't have time to talk about all the various issues here, but you'll notice here that among other things, it also, these posters deal with, for example, police brutality and gun violence, and also communities and households. So it's a much broader notion of what it means to have reproductive justice. By the 1990s, there was more attention to women's health, but there were continuing inequities. And here's just an example of pediatrics in the 1990s, in which you see more women, pediatric medical school applicants, more residents, but once you hit associate and full professor, no, that's the men. So now I want to turn to the continuing but re-energized moment of medical school activism in 2014 as a result of juries deciding not to indict white police officers in the killings of Michael Brown and Eric Garner. Over 3,000 students at more than 80 US medical schools organized these die-in demonstrations to protest racism and police brutality. And this is quoting a first-year Penn medical student. As physicians and medical students, it's our responsibility to take care of the health and wellness of our community. Police brutality endangers the lives and health of people of color in this country. Here's an example of Yale students at that time in December 2014, outside the main administrative medical school building. Here's examples of University of Chicago medical students, also in December 2014. And it's a month later, in January 2015, that the national organization, White Coats for Black Lives, is founded. Again, I don't have time to talk about as many of the issues, but I do want to make the point that it's a very reactive organization. It takes on issues as they emerge. Gun violence, for example, after the shooting massacre in Florida in 2018. Here you see protesters, including many medical students, arguing that gun violence is part of what physicians and nurses need to care about. After George Floyd was killed in May 2020, healthcare workers outside Grady, and here's an example of Grady, which isn't segregated anymore. Right, the last time we saw it, it had two separate wings. It was now not segregated anymore. And everybody came outside and knelt for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And this is my last slide, to just say that medical activism continues, and it continued through the COVID pandemic as well, arguing about white supremacy, police brutality, and racism. Thank you. I have a little bit of time to answer questions. I know it's only one problem. And if there are Zoom questions,
Yes, I'll.
Yeah.
Thank you. This was so interesting. I guess I was wondering the sort of first generation, let's say, of like, what was the Medical Committee for Human Rights?
Mm-hmm.
So that's like early 60s, right? So it's presumably those medical students would not have, you know, they just temporally, they were not part of the new left at that point. Do you have a sense of kind of
They weren't medical students.
or
Okay, the people who founded the Medical Committee for Human Rights, and I should have said this more explicitly, were actually their mentors.
okay,
All right, they were the professors. Right, so there was a small group of progressive professors who actually founded this group and then said to medical students, this is a way that you can get involved.
okay, so yeah, so the more so then generationally, do you have a sense of how what their background was? Like, was there some involvement with like civil rights stuff, or how did they, I guess, come to have like social consciousness at that point?
The professors?
Yes.
Okay, it's probably wrong to say they were good people.
What? I didn't hear it.
Oh, okay, so the question, what I said was, it's probably wrong to answer that question, what was their background about, that they were good people. They were progressive, often had been hated McCarthyism, right, had rejected McCarthyism, which hasn't disappeared by the 60s, but is much less powerful. They had supported civil rights activists. They were part sometimes of these commissions for civil rights on discrimination and so on. So that many of them had, and some of them actually were exposed. So Bernie Lowen has this really interesting autobiography where he says, you know, he was a cardiologist and he was very interested in his devices, and he was dragged along to a Quaker peace activist from Britain. He said, oh, it's got nothing to do with me. He said, but by the end of the speech, he said, oh my God, this is something that every physician needs to care about. You know, and so sometimes they were just inspired by people who they came in touch with. So yeah.
You know, that's a very naive question, that to imagine that all positions were somehow needed to be galvanized, and that there were no good people.
There were good people.
I mean,
I'm not
there are always
suggesting.
been
You
good
didn't
people.
infer your assessment of how much it was naive.
I think it's actually a really important question that reminds me that as I talk about this, I want to say more explicitly, these are people with a social conscience, not, oh, look, how odd, but, you know, who made a profound difference and inspired a younger generation also. So, yes, many of them were white, but not all. Yeah.
Maybe my question is also a little bit naive, so I apologize. But it's very interesting to see the changing nature of this activist approach and also their goal in this long durée that you have just presented. And my questions would be like, so who would be on the other side? Meaning like, who would like try to oppress these activists what they are doing.
That's not a naive question. Let me say right off the bat that the medical students involved in the 60s say very much felt that they were the people who sat at the back of the lecture, that they were maybe 10%, maybe, of their medical school classes. And that most people said, why are you wasting your time on this? Put your head down. Like, you know, study for your exam. You know, don't challenge the professor. You're here to get a medical degree. You know, and so and there were certainly also other fellow students who said, you do understand they could kick you out for this. Don't you want to get a medical degree? You know, so, and I have a couple of stories of people who go before the dean, and the dean says, give me some reason why we shouldn't expel you for whatever. Now, most of these stories, they give them one expel. But I also know the story of an activist, Chip Smith in Philadelphia, who was at Penn, and in his fourth year, I think it was his fourth year, after a year of working at the city hospital, he quit, and he wrote a long letter, which was published in all the student papers about what it was like taking, going to have these poor Black patients who had no idea who he was or why he was taking blood from them, or what he was doing, or whether he was a kid about them. He said, I just can't do it. And he never went back. No, it's very important.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rogers, for today. I was just wondering, so based off of all of the historical analysis and everything, what do you think are some key takeaways that students can do today and implement or like change from the past that you think, like what strategies maybe that they can use that could
This is going to be
be
part of my
effective?
book. All right.
Oh,
No, because I'm very aware that I want people who read about this to be asking exactly those questions. So in a not very coherent way, let me say, one major lesson is I want activists today to not imagine that they are reinventing the wheel. All right, that they have a past, they have an activist past. It didn't always go very well. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. But that it's really important for you not to feel, I guess I could stand up, that people have stood up in the past. I think that's a really important thing. I think that they're, more broadly, and I didn't get a chance to talk about this as much, but I think some of the reasons that a number of medical and nursing students within the medical school were able to achieve significant changes is that there were a lot of activists outside, right, banging the doors down, as it were, right, non-medical and nursing students, non-professionals, who say, look at the terrible way you're running your hospital, or your medical school, or your clinic, right? And so there was a synergy there that helped both sides in many ways. And on top of that, just to be honest, many of the outside activists were much more radical than the inside ones. So the inside ones could always say, you know, we're not suggesting doing this, but we think, you know, it should continue. but here are all the things you need to do to make it better, right? And like, oh, thank God, please don't burn it down. And there were some burned down, so just, so, they were more radical, and that helped, insiders so those are just. Yeah.
Kind of following off that question a little bit, and it's really interesting to hear the trajectory, what has changed and what hasn't changed. I mean, some of the demands, some of the goals of those early groups in the 60s are the very same, right? Sort of getting medical students out in the community more. I mean, that right continues to be a big issue in medical education. And so I wonder if you could just, I'm sure the book's going to focus on that too, but I would love to hear you comment on that trajectory. What hasn't changed, what has changed?
Well, just to say, you definitely have your finger on something that I think is really exciting, which is that, especially beginning with the SHO and continuing, there was an effort to say, we need to be in the community. Initially, they said all the community, and then they realized that we never actually all the community, but be allies with the community, right, in order to articulate community needs. And so perhaps we might be maybe interpreters or translators of the community. Now, by the late 60s, there were many radical community nationalist groups, Young Lords, Black Panthers, who said, just shut up. Okay, we can speak for ourselves, thank you very much. But they did say to some of these students, why don't you go back to the institution of faith and you can big? So you actually see a sort of shift somewhat. I would say away from the community, but to stop thinking of themselves as the voice of the community and actually think about how can we make the institution better. And those issues have definitely not gone away. There's a very interesting story to be told about the relationship between medical schools, for example, and their local communities. And it's not a good story. No. And I've written about it. So that's an example of something that's a continuing attention and importance. And one of the really interesting parts of this particular story around that is the federal government kept intervening and had to try to fix it. Money for community groups, money to help medical students train people in the community, whatever, but it just didn't do it. I didn't fix many of the really profound problems in the relationship between medical schools and communities, and medical schools could not help but think of communities as a really useful. You didn't say that. But, and I would say schools of public health and medical schools continue to think that way. Now, it's phrased differently, and it is much more aware that the kind of research that you do is supposed to give back to that community, right? You don't just go in and say, we're going to check it all out and then we'll publish it and we'll let you know, right? There's supposed to be more interaction. It depends on the school and it depends on the federal regulations that go with the grants that fund that kind of thing. So that's just one part. Yeah.
I think another one, student, an older student has been brought up a couple of times. Emily has talked about the sort of extractive nature of training that you mentioned. I think that's really persisted. It's really the training of trauma surgeons, especially, is quite a visible expression of this. In that you go to, if you want to go to an esteemed trauma center, there has to be a place where there's lots of horrible injuries. And so places like often like a community hospital in Los Angeles, a place in Philadelphia, Johns Hopkins, or
There's probably quite a lot of places.
Chicago,
Yeah.
is that it's sort of dependent on the violence of the neighborhood in order for it to be an esteemed program. And so there's sort of an incentive mismatch. I wonder if that's almost, if the sort of esteem of being a community physician has almost had a reverse trajectory, in that there's first of all the social benefit of saying you're serving a community, but then the professional benefit of saying you trained in this very high acuity place. I wonder if that's increased, or as other things have maybe gotten better as gun violence continues to be
That's a very interesting question. I want to point out though on the word community physician. No trauma surgeon would ever consider herself a community physician. Community physicians, and they are a real, that is a real kind of specialty, are mostly internists, some psychiatrists, some pediatricians, who see their role as working in community-facing centers, dealing with local issues that often do not necessarily have a hospital-based answer, right? So that they may be affiliated, whatever, but for example, if they're faculty, they will bring their students out into the clinic rather than like lecture to them in the hospital about that. You know, they're much more focused on sort of on the ground care, and they often have particular interests like in substance use and other kind of issues as well. But they would never think of trauma surgeons to say that. But I take your point, it is extractive. Yeah, sure.
Thank you for this talk. And you made a remark about federal funding and pouring money onto problems.
Yes.
I guess my question is what you've encountered in your research about like NIH and NSF, and I would think in the 50s and 60s, the Atomic Energy Commission dumping money into research. Do you see this trajectory of liberalism in those federal funding organs? Or are they operating in a different world than medical schools?
Oh, what I love this. So this gives me the opportunity to use the word yellow berets. All right. So what happened is that the draft was there for every single medical student, right? And the NIH had a program in which they offered prospective researchers and medical students when they graduated a 2 to 3 year research that would count towards their military service. And they called themselves, and I told yellow berets. Okay, it's a little weird, okay, a little creepy, okay. You know,
Just so you know,
but
I'm a yellow beret.
there you go, we have one, right, and they were at the CDC, and they're at the Public Health Service, and, you know, they were in some of the research institutes at the NIH, right, and the idea was to help young men who otherwise would end up in Vietnam, wherever, but also to establish a new generation of young researchers. Did this make the NIH more liberal? Okay, I don't know. You want to try that one?
Well, you know, I have to put it in context. I began medical school in 1959. So I was part of a lot of what Dr. Rogers was talking about. And we lived through the McCarthy era. And the McCarthy era was terrifying and also a very formative part of what life was. And apropos of the Yellow Berets, the program at the NIH preceded the Vietnam War. It had nothing to do in its formation with draft dodging, although you ended up that way by getting in a military
No, the
credit.
Vietnam War was first. The Vietnam War
Yeah,
began in 54.
yeah,
So
but it was not prevalent here.
Korea, that was also part of the.
Yeah, I mean, when I went to the NIH program, and it was a program to develop medical research. And that was my intent from the day I entered the medical field, and I was a medical investigator. And so, and I was liberal, I participated in the list of things that I did because of my background. But we were products of our time. So when we talk about liberalism or progressivism or whatever term you use, you are progressive for your time, and you can't use the criteria of today for comparison. Everything is different. There was no television, there was no communication, so everything that we did was different.
Okay, I have a question from the chat, which I'll just read. You mentioned the prestige or shock value of the white coat on the street in the 60s, dependent, of course, on their hierarchical position. Are the sources of doctor power in social change changing as well? Any thoughts on this? So I do think that no one in American society believes that we dressed in a suit and tie and went down to a jail and stood there, that this would make any difference whatsoever to the way that jailers are dealing with prisoners in whatever issue it was. So I do think that there are, that in a lot of ways, the kind of extra respect and awe that physicians used to have has significantly dissipated, which we could also link to one of the issues that the students argued in the 60s was that they were sick and tired of the hierarchical culture that they lived in, and they didn't see why they couldn't wear, you know, like short sleeves or long hair or something. And the hospital staff said, "I'm sorry, are you in the medical profession or are you a hippie?" And they won. The students, it took a while. But so there was also an effort to sort of change the image, the way that physicians looked. I can remember the fights when physicians and nurses began to want to wear scrubs outside the operating room. And their superiors were like, what do you, this isn't fancy dress. You can't leave the hospital and go get a soda in that. And they said, yes, you can. And they do. You know, so there's a lot of really interesting moments that are explicitly linked to the way that physicians used to claim a certain kind of hierarchy, and senior nurses as well. So I would say we need to be aware that there is still very significant social power for physicians, but it's different. And I think that that's what's quite interesting in White Coats for Black Lives, which is one of the things that they felt was really important was the white coat, right? That the white coat was intended to send a signal much beyond the medical school, right? White coats are really very, don't send a great deal of signal within the medical school, but outside it, in order to say, here is the profession, the social role that we are going to claim. And in that role, we are saying there are issues in social justice that are important to us and should be important to you. And we can speak as experts on that. So I'm not saying how well that works, but it's really striking to see. It's white coats for black. Right. It's also not just a medical association, which was part of the SHO, but very aware that it shouldn't just be doctors or doctors on top and everybody not. I've talked to another one. Okay. Well, thank you all so much for coming.